Are there any similarities in the debate around Sri Dasam Granth, which raged, say, 10 or 20 years ago, and then slowly started to whittle down as the community became more informed, with now how we're seeing kind of controversies around Suraj Prakash slowly kind of whittle out?
Yeah. It's a good question. It's a really good question, and you're absolutely right. Like the kind of stance, the kind of the perception of Dasam Granth over time has changed. Certainly in the West over the past 10, 20 years, we can see that. I mean, it's not clear to me if that's because there's been a good contextualization of the Dasam Granth itself, or if the culture in the West has just changed. Like, for example, a lot of the objections to Dasam Granth have been to perhaps content relating to romance and like for example in the Chirtropakyan, right, you have sexual encounters and what have you. So I think in the West, the diasporic community has kind of just matured to an understanding that why couldn't the guru write about these things? First of all, that's not the main thrust of the text. Like it's just so funny to me that the older generation, it's understandable, coming from a more colonialized culture of sexuality and romance and relationships, where that, if they were looking at a text which had any component of that, they would say, oh, this, how could the guru write such, material? And I think just the diasporic youth in the West have understood that, okay, first of all, that's not the main thrust of the text. The text is talking about deception. There's not a manual on any of those type of, and in that storytelling manner, if these things come up, that's fine. Like, everybody grows up, they watch Game of Thrones or 300 or whatever people are watching in the West right now, right? So it's not unusual to encounter that type of material. So all of which to say, I'm not sure if the pro Dasam Granth camp has done a good job in contextualizing it, or it's just the reason why people were objecting to Dasam Granth. Those notions in the West have kind of fallen apart. Especially, like, let's talk about Chandi, for example, as well. Like, is it? It was really funny, and the objections to Chandi is like, oh, the divine can't be a woman. But like, at no point people were like saying that about the Guru Granth Sahib, where it's like the divine at points are Pork, Akal, Pork. It's like, oh, the divine can be a guy. That's fine. It's also a really blunt way of understanding the earth, right? It's not a very intellectual way of understanding the earth. But to them, yeah, the divine could be a dude, but it couldn't be a woman. Both of those are not correct, right? It's not to say that, the divine is, like, Chandi is a woman. Like, you have lines of Gurbani, like the Paramatma is behind, beyond Pork, Istri, and the Punsak meaning that third, right? That which has no Joda, that which is, it would be incorrect to say non-binary because that's going to bring in the dialogue of today's.
But
But
arguably,
that,
non-dual is not. It's a non-dual existence.
yes, yeah. So Chandi as well in the West, I think people have been okay with conceptualizing the divine in certain circumstances as this feminine warrior, and I think that. So I'm not sure if it's just the fact that the pro Dasam camp has done a successful job at contextualizing it. So I think in the same way, I think in the West, understandings about storytelling are gonna be more acceptable to the youth than they were in, for example, a lot of the objection will be like, oh, the guru couldn't have done this. I think the West and the youth are taking a more open-minded approach to a lot of these things, because, and that's going to help, in engaging with these texts as well. So, yeah.
So there were a few questions regarding what Suraj Prakash has to say about particular events. There's one about Vaisakhi, which I'll leave to later on, but the two that were requested the most were to ask you about by Bidhi Chand and then secondly about Guru Tegh Bahadurji's wedding.
So, yeah, I mean, I guess we could plug the podcast here at this point. So I start the podcast with Bidhi Chand's stories, comes about halfway through Guru Har Gobind's life, in the sense of his stories relating to stealing these horses, Dilbag and Gulbag, these horses that are located in Lahore Fort. And yeah, Bidhi Chand is essentially like the Sikh Robin Hood, steal from the rich, give to the poor. Fascinating story. He goes to Guru Arjan Dev Ji. Guru Arjan Dev Ji knows he's a bit of a thief. Guru Arjan Dev Ji says, perhaps you should stop stealing. How about we start with that? And then Bidhi Chand's like, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to stop stealing, but I am your Sikh. And then Guru Arjan Dev Ji says, okay, fine. But, steal essentially from the rich and give to the poor, help those in need, right? Which what Bidhi Chand does. There's stories in the text where there was a poor Sikh who comes, he needs money to marry his daughter. I think this is how the story goes. It's covered on the podcast, and Bidhi Chand goes, steals from this abusive elite essentially, and then provides that poor Sikh with some money. So you have a bunch of these stories, and even contemporary sources at that time, Dabistan, written by a Zoroastrian who's going around, he mentions Bidhi Chand. He goes and then talks to his guru. The author has like a Zoroastrian guru, and he asks about Bidhi Chand as well. And the guru is like, these stories are exaggerated and stuff like that. But Bidhi Chand, he says, is known in the community as like this folk hero. Like he was the dude. So if they're talking about him, and Santokh Singh is taking stories not off the top of his head, as I mentioned, these stories are mentioned in Guru Tegh Bahadur, which is a text written on account of Bhai Mani Singh. Bhai Mani Singh is describing these stories in Katha, and the author of that text is writing them down, saying Bhai Mani Singh described this story to me, I'm writing this down, and then we asked Mani Singh about this question, then Mani Singh replied. So it's like back and forth, there's dialogue in those texts with Mani Singh. And Santokh Singh is not making these stories up. I think perhaps you can kind of talk about are those components controversial, or how did that question come up?
So those questions were asked in order to try and glean some of the historical information out of Suraj Prakash and able to give a flavor to what you cover in your podcast. Someone had asked why Bidhi Chand is often characterized as being small, or if that is just kind of something that's come out of modern Sakya.
I've not come across any description about that. Guru Gobind Singh is mentioned in Suraj Prakash as having a smaller build. Guru Hargobind as being like insanely massive, like for the North American audience, kind of like Shaq, Shaquille O'Neal. But it describes, I posted about this, it's close to 7 foot tall. I think the measurements would be about like 6'7" to like 6'9" or something like that. Just enormous. And this was represented in contemporary art of the Guru, with also how he's depicted later on. In the later 1700s, you have artwork showing Guru Hargobind just like a giant amongst the other gurus in the paintings. But by Bidhi Chand specifically in Suraj Prakash, I've never come across anything. Perhaps there's more to discover. But at this point, we are about 60 episodes left, to the point where we cover all of Guru Hargobind's Katha and his stories. So perhaps we can do another discussion on that if it comes up, but I don't think so. He's described quite as a very strong, very proficient warrior. He is the right hand, the muscle of Guru Hargobind. He is Guru Hargobind's essentially closest associate. When Guru Hargobind passes away, for many months, many years, Guru Hargobind is sad, it says. Both in Suraj Prakash and Guru Tegh Bahadur, it says Guru Hargobind has a sense of loss. Bidhi Chand, that essentially like it remains with him. Like he's just really sad after Bidhi Chand passes away. So which is really fascinating as well.
What does Suraj Prakash say about Sri Guru Tegh Bahadurji's wedding?
Yeah, so for those who want to kind of hear it in full, check out episode 35, 36 of Suraj podcast. It's literally essentially a line by line of those chapters. So each episode is me translating the text as it is. I'm not adding anything to that. I at times say, okay, as a side note, if I want to convey information about the location or about the people in the stories, I might add some contextual information in there, but I'm translating the text as it is. And, those episodes 35, 36, they go through Guru Tegh Bahadur's wedding, if everybody wants to listen, but they're done according to the weddings at the time. And I think it would be really interesting for people to listen in, because one thing that was interesting to me is that I was shocked at how similar the weddings are in terms of like they do Maya, they do Boliyan, they do all these type of things, like Milni is there, like all of these ceremonies that we have today in a Punjabi wedding. They're actually fascinatingly like mentioned in these texts. And I'm like, oh, that's like, so like fireworks are mentioned, which they had at that time. If you can, Google Mughal fireworks and you'll find images of fireworks back in the day. Yeah. So Yeah, I mean, there's so many of the small rituals there that are mentioned and kind of explained. So I really urge everybody to check out the wedding episodes. Some things that are different. The weddings, as mentioned in the text, happen in the late evening, basically nighttime, whereas today the modern Anandakara is going to happen, before noon. And yeah, like, wedding traditions in our Sikh community have evolved over time. That's clear. As described in the text, they're following their familial traditions, which in which they call Brahmins, and they're going to walk around a fire, the fere, the lava, etc. So that those portions are a little shocking to people, but the other portions are not so much, when they're like handing out, like in Guru Tegh Bahadur's wedding, like jalebis to people and like laddus, and like these are mentioned in the text, like big jalebis, big laddus, and etc. So um those type of points, I'm like, man, that's so interesting, because like now, after listening to the podcast, when I go to a wedding, I'm like, oh cool, like this is like 200, 300, 400 years old, these traditions, and they're still happening. And I don't know, I think it's valuable as well. Like anybody sitting there, even like one person who like holds a jalebi and it's like, oh yeah, they were handing out jalebis at Guru Tegh Bahadur's wedding. They've thought about the guru there, right? So
Yeah.
um but yeah, those portions can be seen as controversial, but I think it's best to just understand it as, that's what was happening during that time. Those type of rights, in terms of, birth rights, wedding rights, funeral rights, etc. As the community is developing, and surely it's developing, right? Like Khalsa Panth is not established during that time. Um, so, and the Masand system is still there. So we understand this, that there were elements that were there before, and then they got revised, and things were added to it, and things were taken away. And this is a process, right? And the Khalsa Panth continues with this process, because it has Gaddi as well, it's a guru as well. So um, there's nothing in there that people should be shocked of. This is like, that was a tradition at that time, and that changed over time.
So, what does the text say about the relationship between the Gurus and the Mughal power at the time? Because a lot of modern history reinforces the idea that it's just oil and water. Babur is the menace that starts this reign. There's a friendly period into Guru Arjan Dev Ji Shahidi seemingly coming out of nowhere. So, what does Kavi Santokh Singh Ji say about the relationship between these two houses?
It's a very good question. It's a very good thing to think about as well, because I mean, this is a reason why as well I was so fascinated with the time of Guru Hargobind. It's like you have this shift, right, in the community, that this is the biggest shift the community has seen, right? And it's a shift in which a lot of the community is confused about, and you have these discussions in the text. By Gurdas writes about this as well. Like a lot of the community was confused, like, okay, we are like a saintly people, and the guru's adorning weapons, and the guru's going hunting, and the guru's, essentially now fighting battles against the Mughals. How does this make sense? This guru sits on the seat, the gaddi of Guru Nanak Dev Ji, so those were real questions by real Sikhs, genuine questions, because they understood Sikhi in a maybe perhaps more superficial uh lens, in terms of just exterior practice, not in terms of essence perhaps. But so that's why this makes an interesting time period to examine. But it's interesting because the guru period, like the 10 gurus, falls right over top of the 7 essentially major Mughal emperors: Babur, Humayun, etc., all the way up to Aurangzeb and then Bahadur Shah. And I think for those who have not read Sikh history in any depth, they're going to understand, like you mentioned, water, oil and water, right? Completely separate. There's a couple of facts that are well known. Guru Gobind Singh fought with Bahadur Shah in battle. Guru Hargobind's time with with Jahangir in Lahore. How do we understand this? Guru Har Rai's friendship with Dara Shikoh, the prince, the elder brother of Aurangzeb. How do we understand these relationships, right? And the text goes into this. Another fact is, like, the land of Amritsar was given as a gift by the Mughal emperors to the Sikh community. Or at least that's how the text describe that kind of transfer of land. So if we were to take the text seriously, we have to acknowledge that. But Yeah, it's a really interesting relationship that is a bit of a roller coaster. There's a lot of up and downs. Just like Bhai Gurdas mentions previously, before Guru Hargobind, the emperors used to come and seek blessings from the gurus. Babur came to Guru Nanak Dev Ji, Humayun came to Guru Angad Dev Ji, etc. Akbar comes to Guru Amar Das Ji, and
I think it's in Panth Prakash where it's mentioned that because the Mughals stopped respecting the House of Nanak, that's why their empire fell.
sorry, this is a major point in Suraj as well. It's that, um, you know, essentially Guru Nanak Dev Ji blesses Babur with Raj, with kingdom. This is how the text understands this. And I just want to hold this thought and sustain it for a little bit, and we'll contextualize it. So the way the text talks about it is that Guru Nanak Dev Ji blesses Babur with Badshah, with kingdom, with this Raj, with this empire. And this lasts until the Mughal Empire then starts to disintegrate and fall into kind of oppression, so oppressing people of the state. And this is something that is coming up in the Katha, in the stories of Suraj podcast, is that Guru Hargobind now has just fought in the Suraj podcast his first battle with Shah Jahan, and Shah Jahan really is this point in which it really takes a downturn with the Sikh community. In Guru Hargobind's lines, anyways, in Suraj Prakash mentions that Shah Jahan's being very oppressive to people, that he's fallen away from the Guru's house, that he's not paying tribute, that he's not, meeting with the Guru's house in good terms. And that's where this disintegration then starts to happen. We see that Guru Har Rai has a very special relationship with Dara Shikoh. And we know from contemporary sources that, Guru Har Rai, who maintains a standing army, rides out to fight with Dara Shikoh, but Dara Shikoh then kind of cowers, and he's not able to fight. So, basically Guru Har Rai calls his troops back, and there is no battle. But it was very close to having a battle there, where they would have fought against Aurangzeb. And then we all know what happens was Aurangzeb probably remembers that feud between the Sikh community, and that, the Sikh community supported the other rival. And this is the thing as well, if you read works about Mughal history, Munis Faruqi, a professor here at UC Berkeley, is writing his book on Aurangzeb, but his book on Mughal princes is really important to understand how these rivalries and how succession change in the Mughal Empire relates to conflict with different communities. And if we see that when Jahangir is appointed as emperor, then he starts stuffing out rivals as well. That's when Guru Arjan Dev Ji gets Shahidi, right? Because the people close to him, at least according to Sikh history, are telling him that, okay, this is one group over here, the Sikh group, this is like not a group that we should allow to kind of propagate. So in Sikh history, he later repents that, and he kind of meets with the Guru, and he offers him money, and this, blessings given back for all that, there's a kind of a coming together at some point. Yeah, so understanding how succession change works in the Mughal Empire, how the princes were sent off to engage with different community groups, and then if that prince was, victorious, then he's going to punish the other community groups that he's rivaled with. So, yeah, it's a fascinating story, and it's one which is not black and white. And we know that even by reading stories like, the stories in Panth Prakash written by Ratan Singh Pangu, where, for example, when I think his name was Subeg Singh came from the Mughal Darbar to offer Kilat this, royal tribute to the Khalsa Panth, and they ended up giving it to Nawab Kapoor Singh. They're calling Nawab, right? Some of the Panth was not okay with that. Yeah, some of the Panth was like, we should never accept anything from them. And the other Panth was like, whoa, let's accept it and let's use it for our benefit. So it's understandable even today, like when we think about, should we accept donations from everybody? Is it okay to accept donations?
I guess a good comparison is OBEs and MBEs. Another similar controversy surrounds Jassa Singh Ramgharia, who is employed by imperial forces. Jassa Singh Ahluwalia doesn't want anything to do with that, and because of their friction, at one point Jassa Singh Ramgharia shoots Ahluwalia through the arm, showing that these debates aren't that new at all.
These are long-standing debates. These are long-standing debates that have their roots in even the time of the Guru's period as well. So we've had these debates. You can see these debates played out in Rehatanamas as well. These literature based on code of conducts and written in the 1700s, across the 1700s. And even in that, like it says, never trust a Toruk, never basically take money from Toraks, even to the point where you are deemed somebody who crosses the line of Rehet. And that title is Tankaya, somebody who has Tanaka, somebody who has a salary from the Toraks, essentially. That was their way of like kind of degrading that type of service, right? But yet we know, like Jassa Singh Ramgharia, that people did engage in that service. And it did benefit the Panth in some degree, right? In some degree, having people on the inside helped, right?
Talking about Jassa Singh Ramgharia, once he gets employed, he gets everyone else, kind of his families and friends employed. But more importantly, he's able to help lift a siege. And it's due to this, actually, that he's welcomed back within the Panth.
This is where the nuance comes in, right? Where it becomes a much more difficult question than just black and white. Like, for example, in the stories that we've covered on the Suraj podcast, you have Vizier Khan, like a serious senior general of Shah Jahan and Jahangir, who's always pulling strings in the court. Like he by all means comes from a Muslim background, and yet he's a Sikh of Guru Arjan Dev Ji, Guru Har Gobind. And in the court, whenever he's hearing about decisions that perhaps might be detrimental to the Sikh community or to the gurus, he's always there trying to pull strings and kind of orchestrate it in a way to like lessen the damage, or just completely change the mind of the emperor to not do anything. So you have these cases, right? So it's not fair to say like the situation is black and white, and the gurus did fight with the Mughals. Like Guru Gobind Singh fought to help a Mughal prince obtain kingdom, and that's like, you can't get around that historical fact, because this contemporary writings are greats, like Bhai Mani Singh and others have written about it. So all we can do is try to understand how that worked. And that period of time is so fascinating, because like in a time when nobody was allowed to wear weapons in front of the emperor, you have, even in the Mughal archives themselves, Gobind Singh came adorning arms into the court, and you're like, god damn, that's really, really fascinating. When Guru Gobind Singh passes away, the Mughal court records talk about like, oh, should we confiscate all their money and land and stuff like that? They have a lot. And Bahadur Shah writes, we have no concerns with the fakir. It's like, we're not going to disturb the money and the land and the possessions of the fakir. It's like, so the Bahadur Shah on one hand understood Guru Gobind Singh as a fakir, as like a very pious holy man. On the other hand, Guru Gobind Singh is coming strapped up, like armed to the teeth into the court, and he's fighting in a battle. Like, so these notions are just so interesting when you think about it. Like, how do we view the guru? How is the guru viewed from outside? And that's another thing as well. People get a little bit uncomfortable when thinking about these relations, because in their mind, they think that, okay, this relates then to some type of subordination that the guru is working under. And I think we should revisit that, because Guru Nanak had a job, right? What was his job, right? Does that mean that his boss was like ahead of him? Or is this the Leela? This is the Kale, this is the game of the gurus, right? They're working on so many levels and different dimensions that for us to just look at it like, oh, in the economic hierarchy, like the gurus below, X person, this is, not, praiseworthy, etc. I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. And I don't think that's how Sikh history has looked at those type of relations until more recently. So